my big picture introduction is, right now the world has conflict and all kinds of challenges. We see this true in this country. We see it true in lots of other countries and situations around the world. And I think this is a time where we've got to figure out, how do we work together? How do we create common language and collaboration? Because it's the only way we're going to solve things like the pandemic, or the only ways we're going to solve issues like systemic inequities and injustices. And when I look to those models of collaboration, the work that Shamil's been doing his entire career, the work that Search for Common Ground does, I think is such a powerful model. And so when we talk about Mandela and we talk about Gandhi, we're talking about individuals and leaders who practice a certain style of leadership, promoted concepts of nonviolence, and ultimately models of collaboration. And Martin Luther King and John Lewis, these are all such examples of these things. And so in the best spirit of those traditions is the work that Shamil and Search for Common Ground is doing. So Shamil, I spent the morning speaking and telling the story of Nelson Mandela and the meaning behind the words that he spoke at the Laureus Awards about the power of sports to change the world, and ultimately the Rugby World Cup example. But what I've shared with the team before is the amazing work that you've done with Search, and you can give some context on this, and how sports has actually been a program that you've run and used as a mechanism for bringing people together in the most difficult situations. So I'm eager to give Shamil the floor for the next 15 minutes to share kind of his perspective and how they view sports, how he thinks about where the world is today and what opportunities that we have. I should also point out that Shamil is a Yankees fan, a big-time Yankees fan. And so when we talk about intractable conflicts, the Red Sox-Yankees conflict is way up there as well. So I'm not sure if that gives some credibility for the group or lack of credibility for the group. Although I don't think Mets fans are mad at Yankees fans. I think they're just jealous. But sorry, that was a dig at Koffler and Jared and others. But I am excited to turn it over to you and get your perspective on things as we wrap up the day and reflect on the power of sports as a platform. So Shamil, welcome to the LeagueApps team.
Great. Thanks very much, Jeremy. And I didn't wear my Yankees hat, but it's in my heart. So I really appreciate it. I've gotten to know Jeremy over the years. And as he said, I lead an organization called Search for Common Ground. It's the world's largest peacebuilding organization. We've got about 1,000 employees working now across almost 30 countries around the world on the front lines of some of the most challenging conflicts in the world. And our methodology is hugely locally rooted. So what we find is when you're trying to bridge pretty intractable differences, it helps a lot if you listen to the folks who are on the front lines. And one of the tools that our teams around the world have used repeatedly, which might not come as a surprise to you all, is sports. Because oftentimes when nothing else can bring people together, sports can. And so Jeremy asked that I share a little bit with you some stories and some highlights of our methodology and how sports have come into play. But I really understand you all to be operating right at the intersection of both sports and youth, which is a pretty powerful combination. And so just a couple words on youth and where we are right now. We're living today at the moment in human history with the largest global youth cohort in history. And, you know, it's oftentimes said that young people are the leaders of tomorrow. Repeatedly, and not just now, but throughout history, young people have almost always been at the forefront of major social change movements. You mentioned some of the greats, Gandhi and Mandela. Mandela was only 25 years old when he established, he co-founded the African National Congress's youth wing. Gandhi was only 24 when he established the Natal Indian Congress in South Africa before returning to his home of India to lead the movement there. And Martin Luther King, who you mentioned, was only 26 when he led the Montgomery bus boycott. And a lot of people have heard of Rosa Parks because of that boycott, but weeks before Rosa Parks, some of you might have heard of Claudette Colvin. She was the 15-year-old who inspired Rosa Parks. She refused to give her seat up to a white man on the bus. And it was actually her case that went to the Supreme Court. And when it was settled, that's what led King to call off the boycott. It was Colvin's case, the 15-year-old, that went that far. And we're seeing today younger and more women. Malala Yousafzai is the youngest Nobel laureate. She started her movement for educational access at 15. Greta Thunberg started her climate change movement by protesting all alone outside of the Swedish parliament when she was 15. So young people are always and across every culture really powerful change makers. And today we're seeing an unprecedented level of youth mobilization. Before the pandemic, we were seeing popular protests in virtually every region of the world, in Lebanon, in Sudan, bringing down a dictator, in Guinea, in China, all around the world, largely youth-led, increasingly women-led. And we're certainly seeing this here in the US now, even in the midst of the pandemic. So that's just a plug on the power of young people. A lot of people sort of throw kind of a rhetorical nod to young people. But if you actually look historically, young people again and again under the age of 30 and increasingly under the age of 25 have been the primary leaders of social change movements that have then caught on, you know, community-wide, region-wide, worldwide. In terms of sports, you know, it's interesting what we're dealing with right now in the States. We can see the current protests over racial injustice being somewhat bookended by Kaepernick kneeling, what's happening with NASCAR, so much so that people kind of forget that the Black Lives Matter movement actually started before Kaepernick. But sports obviously give this huge platform to activists, for those who choose to use it, to really capture the popular imagination and draw people into major movements. But even when you come below that sort of global icon level of change, the Muhammad Ali types, you know, who lead social change movements or inspire people because of the platform that sports has given them. If you come down to the community level, it's really quite extraordinary what sports can achieve. I'll give you a couple very quick stories. In 1999, the United States was 20 years into basically a Cold War with Iran. Since the Iranian Revolution in 1979 and the takeover of the US Embassy there, no official Americans had visited. There had been no delegation of Americans to visit Iran for 20 years. And in 1999, my organization organized the first official visit of Americans to Iran in 2 decades, the first time the American flag was flown in Iran in 2 decades. And that was for members of the American Olympic wrestling team to participate in the Takhti Cup. And the thinking behind this actually started between 2 diplomats. You know, the guy who had served as Khomeini's ambassador to the UN throughout the 1980s, a guy named Amir Mahalati, and a guy named Bill Miller, former ambassador, American ambassador to Ukraine. Bill had been named ambassador to Iran by Jimmy Carter, and then the embassy was taken over a week later, and he never got to go. But he had always loved Iran. And so Bill Miller and Amir Mahalati, these 2 ambassadors from different countries, were sitting in our office in 1999, trying to think about what could we do that might open up informal and perhaps discreet political dialogue between these 2 countries. And they threw out a million ideas. And what they eventually came up with was wrestling, which is huge in Iran. Wrestling is bigger in Iran than I think any sport is here. The historical events, mythological figures are wrestling. It's a huge event. So when the Americans went to participate, it made news all over Iran. When they came back, President Clinton invited them into the Oval Office as an explicit choreographed message to the Iranians that the US was interested in perhaps opening relationships again. And I remember talking to Kevin Jackson, the American Olympic world heavyweight Olympic gold medal winner. He said, you know, when they arrived in Tehran, they were all nervous. And he said they got in at like 2 in the morning. That's the only time that international flights would get into Tehran from where they were going. And he said there were hundreds of Iranians at the airport welcoming them. And he said they knew his name. And he said, you know, I'm an American gold medal winner. No Americans know my name. I mean, nobody has any, because wrestling is not that big here. But there it was huge. And it was such a warm welcome. They participated. That one exchange led to hundreds more exchanges. And it also built the trust for our organization to facilitate very discreet dialogues between political representatives on and off for 20 years until both John Kerry, the Secretary of State at the time, and Javad Zarif, the Iranian foreign minister, just 3 years ago, thanked our organization for providing breakthrough ideas that made the Iran nuclear deal possible. That all started with the wrestling tournament. And that was all modeled on ping pong diplomacy, which is what started the thaw in relationships between the United States and China in 1971. You know, after the Communist Revolution in 49 had similarly cut off ties. So one way that sports has been used by us and by others is actually to thaw long frozen relationships in a way that is competitive but safe, you know, and it's been done multiple times internationally, even at that level. But then if you come down to more the communal level, there are countless examples where we and others have used sports. And I'll give you a quick example. When I was living in Burundi in Central Africa, this was right after the Rwandan genocide. And Burundi had a similar ethnic breakdown between ethnic Hutus and ethnic Tutsis that Rwanda did. And one day, a documentary filmmaker came into my office and said, look, you guys have a radio studio. We had started a radio studio for ethnic Hutus and ethnic Tutsis to co-produce radio programs because radio is really powerful in that part of the world. And in fact, radio was used, unfortunately, really effectively in Rwanda to foster the genocide and mobilize people against each other. So we were trying to use radio for the exact opposite purpose. So this guy visits our office. He said, I'm filming a documentary. I'm filming the story of multiple generations of these two families, Hutu and Tutsi, that have led to these two young men who are on opposite sides of the killing. One who's a rebel leader, and the other who's part of the government organized killing gangs, essentially at that time. And he said, I've gotten them to agree to actually meet with each other, and we need a safe venue. So they used our radio studio as the first time that these two guys met. And so I got to meet them then. Documentary filmmaker went away. I started meeting these guys more regularly. We go out to bars together. They were about 19, 20 years old at the time. I started asking them, is there anything that we could do that could start bringing young people together and across Burundi's divide, that would prevent them from going down the path that you guys have gone down? And they both said soccer. Soccer's the way to do it. So we started organizing soccer tournaments very carefully between former fighters. And we would, get down to, we eventually did individual games, and then we did weekend tournaments where people would stay in the same room with one another, and we had to be very careful about the ethnic breakdown of the room. And eventually these two guys turned into a small little committee of guys who got to know one another through these soccer tournaments. And eventually those soccer tournaments went nationwide in Burundi and led to an initiative that won a UNESCO award for peacebuilding projects across all of Africa, all because of these soccer tournaments that these guys had started. And so I could give you countless examples, and we've done similar things with sports in more than 20 countries around the world. It's incredible how sports can be used, and there are a couple reasons for that, and I'll close with this and then be happy to open it up for any questions or conversations. Sports engage young people, first and foremost, really effectively, and young people, again, are huge social change agents. Second, sports a lot of times, and specifically in the examples that I just gave you, sports can oftentimes kind of dilute the power dynamics that are really difficult to navigate when it comes to conflict settings. When that American and Iranian ambassador were trying to figure out a way that the US and Iran could participate in something together again, one of the big challenges was the sort of superiority complex of the Americans and the inferiority complex of the Iranians. They were trying to think of a venue they could come together on equal terms. And they came up with wrestling because wrestling was one place where the Iranians were at least as good, if not better, than the Americans. And you can see this today. You see viral videos going out all the time from different neighborhoods across this country, the US, where a police officer and some kids will pick up a basketball and play against each other, because that's an immediate leveling of playing field. And oftentimes even you might assume that the kids will be better than the cop, in those encounters. And so sports have an incredibly powerful symbolic ability to level the playing field, quite literally, between people who outside of the sports arena might not have level power dynamics. And lastly, sports are very explicitly one venue where people actually have to work together in teams towards common goals. And so all of these ways make sports a really powerful entry point to bridge differences that might otherwise be unbridgeable. And the last one you'll see, Jeremy talked to you about it this morning, and you'll see it referenced tonight. The symbolic power of sports is really hard to overstate. One of the most powerful moment in the South African transition is when Mandela put on that Springbok uniform. And it was incredibly unifying. And he talked a lot about all the things that the ANC members who were with him throughout the years of struggle that they wanted him to do. They wanted him to change the national anthem. They wanted him to change the Springbok uniform. They want all of these things that were part of the national symbols of an apartheid regime. They were pressuring him to get rid of all of them. And instead, he appropriated them. He said, no. We want people to be proud. We don't want people to think they're losing something. We want them to think that we're gaining something. So he took those symbols and he actually made them universal. Rather than saying we have to tear down all the symbols, he said, I'm just going to appropriate them and we're going to join them in that celebration. And it's incredibly powerful. So in addition to the things that we've done with sports, you can see the symbolic power that sports have had when people like Mandela or Muhammad Ali or others have used them for those kinds of purposes. So I'll stop there. I'm happy to answer any questions or get into any kind of conversation with you all, but I'm very excited about the place where you all are and that you've got somebody like Jeremy there who really understands the intersection between, athletics and peace building.
So Shamil, first, thanks for those remarks and those thoughts. And it's great color for I think people watching the movie tonight and think about this. A few different kind of ways I want to take the conversation. And if folks have other questions, feel free to chat me as well. And I'll throw it to Brian in a second. I know there's a question as well. So just chat if you have questions and I'll call on you. One is we're sitting at this time of a pandemic, right? Where we're being told to kind of distance from each other. Yet the pandemic is also something that's pretty global in nature. How would you describe the state of our world and where we're at right now, and the kind of opportunity that exists for new models of collaboration, where something like where sports is a platform, if we can recapture it and leverage it, what opportunities do we have to actually make an impact with something like something like sport?
Yeah, I mean, not to overstate it, but we are, I think, living at the end of one world order and at the birth of another one, and it's not here yet. And this transition moment is incredibly, incredibly dangerous and hopeful, right? If you look at the period from 1950 until 2000, you see the levels of violent conflict around the world drop precipitously to the lowest levels in human history, both on a per capita and aggregate basis. And a lot of that was because the international system that was set up after World War II, the United Nations, if you look at the UN Charter, the first thing it says is they're setting this up to prevent another war between the great powers. They've just been through World War I and World War II. We have to prevent another war like this, and we've got to join in common cause to solve problems together. There were all kinds of problems with that system, right? The fact that there are no permanent members of the UN Security Council from all of Africa, all of South America. I mean, I could go on at great length about the deficiencies with that system, so I'm not glorifying it. But if you compare it to what was happening just before then, it's incredible the level of international cooperation and war prevention that was enabled through that multilateral system. That was all the way up until the year 2000. If you look at where we are today, and along with those drops in violence, every other form of well-being exploded in positive directions, with one notable exception. So levels of the expansion of human rights, women's leadership and women's rights, democratization. There were less than 10 democracies in 1945. There were 100 in 2018. Every single region of the world grew in terms of economic productivity and had precipitous drops in poverty levels. Every single region of the world from 1950 to 2000. Right? And I could go on, you know, poverty eradication, disease eradication. If you look at the first 20 years of this century, we're now in 2020, a lot of those gains are being reversed. We're seeing a rise in authoritarianism. We're living in a 25-year high in violent conflict. We're seeing the kind of international cooperation that needs to be mobilized in order to fight a pandemic, you know, or secure more stable financial markets. All of those things are failing in many ways. And there are a lot of reasons for that we don't have time to go into. But what there is right now is a real recognition that we need a new system for fostering trust and cooperation across dividing lines. There's all kinds of efforts to reform the UN, to reform the European Union as a result of Brexit, to relook at, you know, how are we going to do things. And, you know, I worked at the UN, I worked in these systems, but I'll be the first person to acknowledge that that system's broken. There are a lot of things that system doesn't accomplish. And so where does sports fit into this? I'm not smart enough to know what the next world order is going to look like, but I'm pretty sure there are two elements of it that will have to be different from what we're coming out of. First, I think we're going to need to have much more inclusion and genuine inclusion of young people, young people's voices, because if we don't, we're going to see them asserting their rights in ever more forceful and eventually violent ways, whether we like it or not. That's just the reality, especially when you're living with the largest youth cohort in history. And second, we're going to have to see much more engagement and leadership from women. Women's leadership, and we can go into all the reasons for this, but you know, if you look at peace processes that involve women and peace processes that only involve men, it's pretty marked how different, you know, they are in terms of the results and how long the results last. And so the regeneration of trust and the rebuilding of ties across dividing lines, preventing a war between the US and China, you know, fostering trust again across dividing lines in this country domestically and internationally. Sports are one of the most powerful ways that we can do that. The Olympic movement is one of those powerful symbolic ways that we can do that. I'm not saying it's the only pathway to it, but I definitely feel, and we're seeing this, you know, you can take the microcosm I gave you of what happened in Burundi, what's happened between the US and Iran. I could give you 50 other examples like that if we had time. We need to see much, much more of this. And especially as communities like our own become more polarized and segregated, and even self-segregated, sports remain one of the few things that brings people together. The most diverse settings for me, sadly, you know, personally, as an American growing up in this country, are the mosque and the basketball court. When I take my family to the mosque, there's much more racial diversity there than almost any other setting that I participate in. And when I play basketball, pick up basketball in Washington, D.C., there's much more racial and other kinds of socioeconomic diversity and other kinds of diversity than anywhere else. Those for me, and it might be different for you all, but I think for me, that's also a very personal lens into where can we start generating the kind of relationships and dialogue and cooperative problem solving that we need from the community level all the way up to the international level.
That's great. So I'm going to throw it to a few people, and then I'll save one or two questions for myself at the end. Brian, you have a question. Maybe introduce yourself, and Lydia, share what your question is for Shamil.
Hey, Shamil. I'm Brian Litvack. I'm one of the co-founders of LeagueApps and the CEO. Jeremy speaks about you all the time, so it's great to, and Search, and how proud he is to be part of the organization. So it's great to meet you. And I appreciate everything you're saying today. It's been enlightening just to hear about why sports creates these conditions for social change. And I wrote them down of diluting the power dynamics and leveling the playing field, and explicitly having kids and youth work together. We work with 3,000 plus sports organizers, and most of them are disassociated from Scholastic. It's town leagues, communities, club teams, tournaments. And these sports organizers are doing that. They're creating these conditions to help, change people's mindsets or habits or beliefs. But they don't know what to do once they have everyone playing in their leagues or their tournaments beyond just running a great sports competition. What can we do, or how can the organizers within communities be better educated to have even more impact on society, not just on the sports, because they have such a bigger place in the community that I think they even recognize sometimes?
No, that's great. Thanks for that question. I mean, I'll say two things. One, the best activism always starts with listening, and some of the best activism starts with young people. So you've got already all these associations that are already cracking one of the hardest nuts, which are how do we get young people together doing anything, across whatever the dividing lines are in our community. And so I would encourage every one of them to open up exactly that question with the young people, after the football tournament or basketball or the scrimmage or whatever they do. I mean, and I'm not trying to be flippant. I think generally the kind of ideas that will, and I think one of the things that's difficult right now in this country is you try to do anything at the national level, and pretty quickly you kind of wash up on the shores of our polarized politics and, what's going on, which is just at the community level where people frankly can't afford, to not do anything together. There are all kinds of possibilities and ideas, and collaboration. But one of the things that rarely happens, and one of the reasons that young people are so frustrated today globally, is because their opinions are simply not sought. And when their opinions are shared, they're not followed. So I think one of the most powerful things that anyone could do if they're bringing together sports leagues is open up a little space for those young people to talk about what's going on in their communities and what they might want to do together to make them a little bit better, even that small bit of improvement. Now, there are all kinds of opportunities beyond that, Brian, for, there's training and how you facilitate group dialogue. There's trainings. The U.S. Institute of Peace has free online trainings. There are networks I can share with you guys. There's a group called Mediators Beyond Borders that, has a nationally dispersed and increasingly globally dispersed community of professional mediators. And a lot of them want to really contribute to their communities. They don't just want to mediate corporate disputes. They actually are looking for things to do. So you could plug in with networks like that. So you could formalize this in a lot of ways. But one thing that I think might be really powerful, and I could share with you all after this, I'm on a volunteer capacity dealing with this. My girls are both in middle school, 6th and 8th grade. And their middle school happens to be here in Washington, D.C., along racial lines, particularly interesting. It's about a third white, a third African-American, and a third Hispanic and Latino. It's kind of unique in that way. And the faculty is also particularly diverse racially. And they've never really, they asked the same question. Like, how can we start, specifically what's going on in this country, opening up areas of dialogue? So I'm working with them to open up some small parental dialogue groups that will include the young people, the students, in the conversations in each dialogue group. And there's some resources. There's a school district right next to us that developed a great online resource with some very short videos, like really short videos, one-page essay from a student about her experience with race that serve as discussion starters, and then like a little kind of facilitator's guide that's really easy, like not too complicated. So you could take something like that and very easily offer that to the coaches or the organizers of the leagues if they wanted to do more than just ask the question. But I could promise you that even if you just encouraged them and said, hey, there's an incentive for you to go after the performance, open up the conversation, ask, these 3 questions and see where the young people lead you, if you foster that conversation well. And if you want resources on how to do that, I'm happy to share them after this.
Awesome. Doug Moore, you had a question. Doug, do you want to pose your question to Shamil? Or does Doug want me to read his question? If Doug can hear me. I think what Doug was looking for, Shamil, was basically examples where private sector, can, like as a company, it's trying to have an impact. Are there models that should be inspirations for us where you can think about how the private sector has, brought people together, impacted questions of conflict or divides?
Yeah, so I mean, in our experience, we haven't actually worked with many sports companies or outlets. Like you guys are actually a really interesting prospective partner, let me just say. But I think what we have worked with is a lot of private sector companies that work in communities that are riven by conflict, and they're concerned with that violent conflict. And so a lot of the companies we work with, for instance, are in the extractive industries, right? These are the mining companies, the gas companies, whatever. These companies make, part of why we work with them, part of why they seek us out is they're not in and out. They make 30, 40, 50-year commitments to communities. If those communities are riven by conflict, they have a real problem. And in today's age, where it's not just armies fighting each other, but one person blows up a pipeline because they're angry, you've got a 50-year investment down the tubes. And so a lot of those companies will work with us, and we'll organize tournaments, sports tournaments, community engagements. And I just want to be really clear, when you're really trying to drive change, a tournament alone, and it's never an event, all right? So that's not what we do. Most of the change that we drive happens over the course of 8 to 10 years, or even a generation. But oftentimes, the only thing that will get people to come together to begin with is something like sports, or a theater performance, or an art exhibit, or something that's so apolitical, that it just kind of gets them out of that mindset. And so we've worked with a lot of companies in organizing those kinds of events. But you guys, with what you have, the access that Brian was just talking to of these thousands of community leagues and that kind of thing, I think that you all could be very interesting as a partner for opening up community level dialogue initiatives and plugging in with existing community YMCAs, YWCAs, or others that try to foster healthy communities and cooperation across dividing lines. So I'm sorry I don't have good examples of sports companies doing this. I'm sure there are many that have. We just haven't had that experience ourselves directly.
Yeah. Two last questions. One that came in is if you can briefly, some people were wondering about the NBA in China as a good example of conflict and how that played out. So any observations about the dynamics between the United States and China, and where sports may have created a challenge, but maybe offers a point of solution between those countries?
Well, it's interesting. The thing with the NBA in China and that incident, it's you want people to know what they're getting into, especially if you're dealing with an international conflict, right? Like if you're talking about a front page international conflict, for the athletes to be there and suddenly a statement to be made and everyone's sticking cameras in their face, asking them, that's a rough situation. When we sent the wrestlers to Iran, it was very clear and things were very choreographed, right? We didn't want them getting themselves in trouble. We also, the last thing we wanted was an international incident that would piss off, excuse my French, either the Iranians or the Americans and take things back. What we wanted was, so we were very careful, all the way down to can they fly the flag or not, and all that kind of stuff. So if you're going to use sports in a high profile thing like that, you want to give the athletes the respect and the due to really be understanding what they're getting into. And now, having said that, some of the most powerful stuff are things where athletes take it into their own hands. The wrestling tournament idea we had was modeled off of ping pong diplomacy. Ping pong diplomacy was not a planned event. If you saw what happened in 1971, this 19-year-old American ping pong player at the tournament in Japan, where the Chinese were also playing, and the Chinese had specific instructions not to interact with the Americans. This 19-year-old self-described hippie jumped on the bus of the Chinese ping pong team when he wasn't supposed to. They all kind of sat back from him, but the best player on the Chinese team went up to him, shook his hands, and gave him a picture as a gift. And so the 19-year-old American took off his shirt, or gave him a shirt, a T-shirt with I think there was a Beatles saying on it or whatever, gave it to him as a gift. And hearing of this, Mao Zedong, the premier of China, shocked everybody, including Nixon himself, when he heard about this exchange and invited the Americans to come as a delegate. And that's when Nixon said, he wrote in his book later, I was shocked, and we sent them, and that opened up, relationships. So, if the athletes themselves want to take a step in that direction, more power to them. But you can't put people in a position and then kind of suddenly throw them in the limelight and something that they weren't prepared for. It's really, I would say, kind of unfair to them. But I think it can, Jeremy, open up those kinds of openings. I like the China story because what it makes clear is it kind of exposes the lie to the notion that individuals can't have incredible power on their own. Individuals can have huge power. And so sports can have a lot of influence. And yeah.
And that's the note I wanted to end on. And look, we're going to watch the story about Mandela tonight. And to look at Mandela and how he sports is one thing. It's another thing to think about all the problems we have in the world. And it's easy to get cynical about what difference is one organization or one community, one person going to make. So if you had a way in all of your work to see the power of the individual, anything you want to say as a way of conclusion, you think about the kind of impact, the kinds of organizations we're dealing with, where maybe there's a future Mandela playing for them, but in more reality, they're small communities in which individuals are well-intentioned. What kind of impact can that have?
I think one of the most important things we need to reestablish in this country is things that we can all be proud of together. And right now, one of the flashpoints are the symbols and the things that we celebrate, the statues, the flags, all of this. And to me, I think on the other side of that, my hope is that we don't just have one set that replace another one and half the country or a large part of the country doesn't feel proud, but that we reestablish some symbols and some things that we can all be proud of. And I think the place where that happens is at the communal level. It gets news at the national level, but at the communal level, where people across racial lines and socioeconomic and other lines are living, that's where I think we can start reestablishing things we can all be proud of. And one of the few things left in this country that everyone is still proud of at the local community level is their team, and so I think that if we actually are intentional, and frankly, if a company like yours that had the reach that you do across the country were intentional about not trying to politicize sports. That's different from trying to reestablish a sense of communal shared pride and communal bonds and communal trust and cooperation and using sports as an entry point for opening that up. I think that could be really exciting. And again, as always, I'll end with this. The most powerful things about young people and movements is you can't foretell where they're going to go. If you give them support, and if you listen to them, and you they'll take it in ways that will be more exciting than anything that I could sort of guess at right now. And especially if you did it across, the 3,000 or so communities that Brian was talking about.
Awesome. Well, if everyone wants to unmute themselves and join me in thanking Shamil for coming here and for inspiring us, and give him a round of applause. Thank you very much, or some virtual applause. So a lot of Zoom reactions and whatnot. But Shamil, thank you for being here and for inspiring us. And I think it's given us, what's great is it's gone deeper to explain the why behind sports. It's not just the description that sports and rugby did this, but it's the underlying connection between youth